Sometimes I might hear somebody say, "Oh, well, because I was white, I didn't get this job. That person of color got it." And first of all, that's an assumption that you were more qualified than the person of color. Actually, you probably weren't, because research shows that you have to be way more qualified even to get an interview as a person of color. There's tons and tons of resume studies that show this globally. But if that is true, I would challenge the person and say, "Well, you know what? Now you understand from this one experience a little bit of what I'm going through all the time. And that maybe makes you better able to connect with the oppression that the people around you, the people of color around you, are dealing with. So maybe you can use that experience in that way to develop your empathy rather than, sitting around crying and complaining about how hard done by you are."
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Before we get started today, just want to do a quick shout out to remind you all of all kinds of fun ways to get involved and to build community. We have professional consultation groups available. We have a course that we do live Q&As periodically. It also has a peer reading group within it to learn with other folks. We have a book, of course, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World. So there's lots of ways that we are working to support you and provide different ways to connect and to plug in. So visit us at therapistuncensored.com and look for the events and happenings page, and you'll get caught up with us. Today's episode, we are proud to bring you Dr. Monnica Williams. She is a psychologist and academic researcher who works at the intersection of racism and mental health. She serves as clinical director and research chair, working with many hats, including the Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities at the University of Ottawa. She's a prolific writer, having over 200 peer-reviewed articles from microaggressions in therapy to pioneering treatments for race-based traumatic stress. Her work has been featured across major media outlets, including NPR, CBS, CBC, Huffington Post, and the New York Times. She is widely recognized as a key voice on racial trauma in North America. Our conversation was wide-ranging. It was blending the research and practical application, which of course we love. There was a conversation about psychedelics and disparity, which was interesting. But we also did a section there at the end where we really kind of modeled and practiced non-defensive reception, that if you have unintentionally harmed someone, a microaggression, if you've made a mistake. So keep listening and you'll get some real nuts and bolts there. Okay, hope you enjoy. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Therapist Uncensored. It is my delight to have Dr. Monnica Williams with us. And why don't we just kick it off by letting you describe yourself for our listeners?
All right. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I'm a clinical psychologist and a researcher and a mom. I work as a professor at the University of Ottawa, where I study mental health disparities, discrimination, racism, the mental health impact of racism, and innovative therapies.
I can't but immediately go to our national mood right now. Have you been impacted by that directly?
Yes, actually, even though I'm in Canada, which provides some insulation, no, I've definitely been affected. In fact, I gave a workshop in Jamaica a couple months ago, for therapists on how to treat racial trauma. And there were several therapists there who were funded to be there by their workplace. Some of them were from the VA, and a few had just lost their jobs because they were people of color, and it was assumed they were doing diversity stuff, so they lost their jobs. I also have a paper that I was working on with some colleagues in the States, and they were told by their higher-ups that that paper cannot be submitted for publication because it's about oppression-based trauma, and God forbid someone thought that that was DEI. So that project is who knows where. I was going to go to a conference next week on racial trauma, and that conference was canceled. I don't have the details as to why that was canceled yet, but I can guess. And lots of my close friends and collaborators are losing their grants.
It's devastating. And how are you all coping? Is there a pivot? Is it going underground? Is it?
I think right now, it's so much is happening so fast. I kind of feel like everybody's just sort of struggling to keep up and make sense of it. But I know a lot of researchers are actually looking to move or looking to leave the US and go other places where they can do their work safely.
Well, one of the things I was most excited about is I always love bridges, and you are known as a bridge builder. You're a clinician, but you also have done incredible scholarly work in this area. And on this podcast, we really like to do the same thing, translate the neuroscience into something applicable and making it accessible to more people than those that just can afford therapy. So I'm interested in both, and I think our audience is interested in both. So why don't we start maybe with some of the most interesting findings from an academic standpoint and those findings that you've translated into some of your clinical work?
Well, I mean, one of the things I've been studying for some time is traumatization that is caused by racism. We call that racial trauma for short. And some of the things we've been uncovering, I think, are really interesting. I mean, for one, when we talk about trauma, in a clinical sense, often clinicians are thinking about a single trauma or an index trauma. We now know that traumatized people often have many traumas. The index trauma could have happened multiple times, or they could be other traumas from their past, and these tend to accumulate. And so the more traumas people have in general, the more traumatized they are in general. And we're finding the same for racial trauma, that it also is cumulative, and even racist things that people have experienced in childhood accumulate with things they experience in adulthood to contribute to unwellness. So you don't have to have a very large or violent thing happen to someone for them to become traumatized. It could be, as you say, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And we've looked at the different symptoms of racial trauma. And for the most part, they are pretty much, it's pretty hard to tell the difference between that and PTSD. All those same symptoms are present in people who have racial trauma as well.
And it's so good to actually have that empirically validated versus just that feeling, it feels intuitively like that makes sense, but you're actually seeing it in the research field.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the research we've done where we've assessed people for racial trauma, we've assessed them for PTSD. I mean, there's like a 90% overlap in terms of people we would say have racial trauma also have PTSD. And then the few that maybe we wouldn't quite diagnose with PTSD, maybe just because they're a little shy on one symptom or another, but in other words, otherwise it looks really the same. But sometimes people also have other things as well, like depression, which can be a symptom of PTSD, or things like social anxiety, as a result of having bad experiences, around certain groups. So those things can be a part of it as well.
Are there differences between being raised as a person of color in a non-dominant culture, where that it's like the drip effect, where you're just living in this power structure that keeps you down, versus overt racism, things like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely the systemic effect of racism in our society, that in and of itself is like a daily stressor. And I would say that it's interesting because sometimes, you encounter people who didn't grow up in this society or culture. Maybe they're from a country, that maybe they're Black and they're from Jamaica, right? Where most of the people are Black. And so, they haven't lived under that same weight, that same sort of weight of that systemic oppression for their whole lives. And so sometimes I often find that people from, environments like that have more confidence because they haven't been beaten down by, a lifetime of people and messages, that just come from all directions telling them that they're not as good or they can't be successful or they can't succeed or people won't believe them or respect them.
Well, it reminds me very much of in the world of, queerness and things like that and coming out, that people that come out later in life and have had this developmental period where that they hadn't yet recognized about themselves have an easier time actually coming out because they have that wholeness and, that it hasn't had that drip effect versus when right off the bat. And so you're just immediately covering and hiding. And that has a very different effect later in the process of, self-identity.
Yeah, absolutely. Although the other side of the coin there is sometimes, when people immigrate from other countries where they're not used to to dealing with this kind of, regular discrimination, sometimes they really struggle adjusting. And sometimes, especially their children, because the parents don't understand the culture well enough to guide and support the kids as they navigate racism.
So you translated some of these things. You write about a concept called civil courage. And I just love that term. Can you talk to us about what you mean by that?
Yes, actually, we started having a lot of conversations about this after George Floyd because, there's so many people who maybe they're not racialized, or maybe they have other stigmatized identities that may or may not be visible, but they want to be allies to people of color, and they often don't know how. And so this was written to address the people who say, I want to be an ally and I don't know how, or they try and they run into obstacles that they can't really explain or understand. And so one really fundamental thing that needs to be unpacked is the fact that everything in our society teaches white people to not talk about it, not engage, not address race, because that is sort of breaks the covenant of silence that maintains the problem. Now, we also have the same problem among people of color, actually, but for different reason, mainly because when we speak out against racism, we're socially punished for that and not believed. And we learned that for our safety, it's better we not speak up. Whereas it's a little bit different for white people, because for most people of color, we're still having those conversations, in our communities and in our group and with people we trust. But for a lot of white people, they just have no practice, no experience, even having these conversations. So when they want to step up and become an ally, I kind of describe it as a brain short circuits, not really knowing what to do.
Well, that we've been living in this diluted world where we're missing a lot of information consciously and unconsciously, where we don't want to attend to it. We've been taught not to attend to it. And so then my understanding is that we think things are much better than they are. And that's why I like to think of it as a delusion. And so the George Floyd thing, for example, or the things that are happening in the United States right now feel so like shocking. People that have been minoritized are like, hello, where have you been? This has been going on all along. This is not new. So there's a lot of, humility.
And it's hard too, because, as you point out, people are taught not to see it, but it's in front of you and it's there every day. It's all around you. Racism is all around us, and it's operating, in relationships, in the media. It's really like something you can't get away from. And it's so interesting too, because so many of us, we hear our white peers and friends say, oh, I don't really see that. And we're like, well, what planet are you on? Because I'm seeing it every day. And why aren't you seeing it? Right. And so I think that's the question that people need to ask themselves. And I ask people this sometimes too. I say, oh, so tell me about the last time you saw an experience of racism. And then their face and their minds go blank. And I say, that's interesting. How is it that you don't see what's in front of you every day? Right. And then make them think about that a little bit.
Well, and what would you say then to white-bodied person that says, well, hey, I'm a man, I'm being discriminated against, that they're embedded in the thing and they're saying, all lives matter, not just Black lives matter.
Yeah, I'm going to pull out my tiny violin and cry a few little tears for you and say, oh, your life's been so hard. So tell me, when was the last time you were discriminated against because of your whiteness? When was the last time you couldn't get a job because you were a white man? When was the last time you were followed in a store because you were a white man, or you felt, like, you're being surveilled because you're a white man? All right. So tell me about these experiences of white racism that have made you feel unsafe. And usually they can't come up with much, except maybe one time they were walking in a park and a Black person called them a name, and they're like, yeah, see that. And then I'm like, yeah, that's not, that doesn't compare.
I want to get more into this as we go, but that you have some clinical protocols and you have some suggestions about becoming a better ally. Do you see, is there kind of a staging that happens? Do you have success when somebody is starting with like, I'm not a racist person, I'm a nice person, but that they really haven't examined it?
Yeah, well, I think if anyone, if they're willing to examine themselves, can, relearn to see these things, can understand the world and our society better, and can operate in a way that maybe feels better and more authentic to them than the status quo. And so it's really just a matter, I would say, of will, because I mean, some people, they're like, well, it's working great for me. I don't know why would I change it, right? Why I don't need to engage with that, right?
I have everything to lose if I change it, and I'm white bodied and I haven't looked at it before. It's a sharing of power that I didn't even know that I had.
Yeah, well, and I would argue certainly on one level it might feel like you have everything to lose, but I would argue that that maybe you have more to gain, right? Because first of all, if you think about all of the people of color in the world, who could be part of your world, who could be part of your relationships, part of your inner circle, could be contributing, that you could be exchanging with. You've cut off a big piece of the world if you cannot productively and authentically interact with people like that. And also, if you're involved in oppressing another group, even without consciously acknowledging it, you also have to think, well, what is the cost to my soul, right? To the part of me that's actually most important, who I am. And I would challenge people to embrace the struggle, the pain, and the anxiety that it will take to be able to operate out of a place of courage for the benefit of, who you are inside.
And just my own personal experience with that is, again, my own journey of like even discovering that I had a race. I mean, it's really embarrassing. It's really embarrassing, but I'm just talking about it because I want everyone listening to go through this process of examining their own identities. And the big light bulbs for me were around this homogeny in education, this Western education, that I had no idea how narrow it was. That when we think of our teachers and our teachers' teachers and our teachers' teachers, I've actively sought outside through this podcast, just in general. And it has been, as far as personally healing, it has brought insight. You study psychedelics as well. This is another example of like going outside the straight and, what we think we know. And so I'm just amplifying what you're saying around what you're missing, but you don't know that you're missing all of this knowledge and cultural experience and community experience. And it's really beautiful. Speaking of psychedelics, is that anything? Tell me about that. How does that weave in?
Yeah, good question. People wonder this a lot because they see that I'm doing research in psychedelics. In fact, we just opened a master's program in psychedelics and consciousness studies at the University of Ottawa. So that was exciting. But I got involved in this area of research when I started, sort of more purposefully studying racial trauma. I had done research in OCD for a long time and started to do more research in trauma. I was contacted out of the blue by MAPS, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And they were doing studies of MDMA for PTSD. And at the same time, finding that they were not having a lot of participants of color in their studies. And so they wanted to know if I would be interested in collaborating with them to help improve the diversity of the people they were seeing to make their research more generalizable. And so when they first approached me, I actually thought this is like really bizarre and I don't want anything to do with it. But when I actually took a deep dive into it, read the research papers, went to their training, saw the video recordings of study participants really getting well, light bulb went on. And I said, this is going to be the future of mental health care. This is going to be the future. And I want my communities to have access to it too.
I just love hearing that because that's certainly going to be such a problem because even though the molecules are all accessible, getting the therapeutic treatment, it's who it's very expensive, corporate world is going to come in, all of those things. So really important to think related to accessibility. Like I hope insurance at some point covers it, that it would be smart for them to.
Yeah, I think they will have to eventually. But, the bigger piece of that, it's like you said, there's the psychedelic chemicals, but also the therapy that goes hand in hand with it. It's a very sort of specialized kind of therapy that we do to help people make the most of their experience. And the relationship between the therapist and the client is very important. There has to be a lot of trust because with a psychedelic, you're becoming very vulnerable and often your defenses are stripped away and you're kind of maybe opening some things that you hadn't opened before and maybe given a choice you wouldn't open in another state of mind. And so you have to feel like that person who's going on the journey with you has your best interest in heart and is going to be understanding and supportive of whatever comes up. And for many of us who are people of color, a lot of racial trauma comes up. And so we need to know that our therapist or guide, they can hold that and not decompensate themselves when confronted with, all of this garbage.
Well, and part of the inequity, I imagine, is the therapists being of color, the therapists having representation among the researchers and the therapists, much less the subject participants, I imagine.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things that I did when I started working with MAPS is they invited me to, a investigator conference where they had all the PIs and the researchers who were part of their multi-site study. And I looked around the room and everybody is white. Almost every single person is white. And I said, well, I think I have figured out the problem. you know?
Ding.
You guys need to diversify your teams here.
Well, it's just like what you said. It's right in front of you, but you don't see it.
Right, exactly. And, and it's kind of sad that like they had to bring me in there to the meeting to tell them that. But yes, to your point, it's like we're kind of conditioned not to see that as strange or abnormal, a room full of just white people.
What is it? Some very small percentage of the entire world, the global world is white, is Western, is industrialized, all of those things. Yet research subjects and mental health clinicians make up the mass majority from Western, white, right? And then we project what we think is healthy child development across culture and without the awareness or understanding of what that actually means, I think.
Oh yeah, in so many ways. We impose our Western viewpoint on everyone else and pathologize them as if they're different. And yeah, and to your point, yes, most of the world are people of color. We call it the global majority. But even in the United States, half of all children are children of color. Half of all births are babies of color. Our demographics are diversifying very rapidly. And if we're going to be relevant as mental health clinicians, we have to be able to do work across race, ethnicity, and culture.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the research you've done in the racial trauma, and that's before this attack on DEI and this just unshaming active racism and things like that. So I just can't even imagine. What are you seeing in your research again? Is there anything you're seeing that is giving you hope?
Right. So many things to be hopeless about right now. But yeah, one of the things that I'm seeing is, I developed a 12-session cognitive behavioral protocol for treating racial trauma. And all of the techniques in the protocol that I put together, they've all been shown in research studies to be helpful with racial trauma, but nobody's put together a whole treatment that has been tested as a whole treatment for racial trauma. And so that's what we're doing now in my lab. We are treating people for racial trauma, and the study's going really well, and people are improving, and that is so exciting. And another thing too that people ask a lot is, well, can only therapists of color do this treatment? Can white people do the treatment too? Should they do the treatment too? And again, this is an empirical question at some level. And we have a variety of therapists, and they're all doing fantastic. So this also gives me hope as well to see therapists of color and white therapists doing great work with our racialized participants. And also, it's great training as well for the clinicians who otherwise wouldn't have that training and didn't get it in school. And now they have a new skill that they can use to help their other clients outside of the research study.
That's incredible. And this is covered in your new book. Is that right?
Yes, actually, my book, it's a blueprint for how to treat racial trauma. It's for therapists. Yeah, and it's step by step talks about everything that you need to do to implement this treatment and help your clients who are struggling with that.
So can you give us some examples, some teasers?
Yeah.
Just so that people can kind of understand. And also, I really would love everyone listening, like, what are some of these things that just talking about it can translate something for them?
Yeah. So there's three major parts to the treatment. So the first part is, I call it part 0, is the assessment process, where you really want to get a good understanding of what the client has experienced and what they're going through. And we have all kinds of tools and scales and interviews we've validated for this. But the first part of the treatment we call stabilization, or stop the bleeding, because often when people are coming for racial trauma, they're usually at their wits' end. They're kind of coming as a last resort because nothing else is working. And often they've become dysfunctional in terms of unable to sometimes go to work or engage in meaningful relationships, and may be on disability. So people are in bad shape.
Yeah, really bad shape. And may I ask you, are people aware? Like, I can imagine people attributing it to themselves, or if you're in individual therapy, it's like you're depressed or whatever. Are people aware that, like, that it's actual racial trauma versus something else?
I mean, usually they're acutely aware that they've experienced racism and that it's been very difficult and painful, but they're often blaming themselves in a very unhelpful way. Like, I should have been stronger, and, how come, I'm breaking down around this, right? So I would say there's often a lot of self-blame when people come in, and feelings of shame. And as you know, shame makes people want to hide, and it makes them not want to come for help. So it's really often quite a struggle for people to even make that first step. So that's why I call it stabilization, because they're usually struggling quite a bit. And what we really want to do in that first phase of treatment is help support them and strengthen them. And we do a lot of validation, just a lot of listening, a lot of validation, a lot of reflective, compassionate listening. And I talk about this a lot in my book because I know this is like therapy 101 for all of us. Yet at the same time, bizarrely, therapists really have a tough time doing this when people come in and talk about racism. People who come in and talk about just about anything else and be validated by their therapist. But when they talk about racism, all of a sudden out comes Socratic questioning, like, oh, well, are you sure that's what it was? Or could it have been something else? Or could they have meant something else? Or, if they're psychodynamic, the therapist is trying to interpret these experiences. And this is like the opposite of helpful. And I think, again, this sort of goes back to our social conditioning, where we actually like forget what we already know when clients come in with these problems. And so a lot of it's just reminding the therapist to be that really good, empathetic listener that they already know how to do, but just remember to do it now. Do it with the clients for this. And whatever the client says, don't question if it's true. Believe them. Because actually the truth is probably much worse than they're even willing to tell you. So, yeah.
That's really powerful. Believe them. The truth is actually much worse than they're probably able to tell you. Oh, wow. That's a good one to really take in, because this idea of, maybe it's not so bad. Or, sometimes I think too around like gender and women not being believed, and just as a little bit of a window into trying to imagine, from an empathetic standpoint, what that's like. And even though it's very different, but believe them, believe them, believe them.
Believe them, support them, remind them that it's not their fault. Oftentimes people, their self-esteem will have been decimated by this. So, I will like love bomb the person to death. I'm looking for every positive quality I can find to remind them of it in themselves, because they've forgotten those things in the course of, of being traumatized in this way.
And I can imagine like reflecting back the system, instead of it being the system as the problem, instead of it being me as the problem, already just what a huge, huge burden to lift.
Yes. And in fact, we have a weekly group supervision for the therapists in our study. And just this week, one of the therapists was sharing that they had seen their client, their study client, for the first time. And the client was talking about how they had never had the experience until that moment that they could talk about their experience of racism and not have somebody second guess it, to just be listened to and heard. So,
So that's one of the important factors.
That's like critical. Like that's got to be your starting point. And actually, interestingly enough, some people get better just from that, just from feeling heard.
I could really see that.
But then the second phase we call healing, and that's where we really start to unpack some of the traumatic experiences, revisit those in a way that can help them look at the trauma from a different perspective. And there's lots of different techniques the therapist can use with the client depending on what resonates with them. Sometimes it might involve journaling and written expression or some prolonged exposure techniques. Could also involve creative activities, poetry or dance around the trauma. We also have instructions for using photo voice as one way to process the trauma, maybe for people who don't like to write or don't want to.
What is photo
Photo
voice?
voice, yes. This is a technique where the client will take pictures of things, and they could do this with their cell phone, pictures of things that remind them of their traumatic experience, in this case, racial trauma, right? And then they bring the pictures in, and then they talk to the therapist. They go through each of the pictures with the therapist, and the parent therapist helps process that with them.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and it can be such a great way, yeah, to help people think, to help them think differently about their trauma. Because as a therapist, you're looking for ways you can help them process it. And usually, what will happen is this will be a way you'll see a lot of the unhelpful ways of thinking about themselves come up through these things, and this is your opportunity to help them see that differently. That's been a great technique too. And another thing we do is we have the clients start logging their experiences of racism, the microaggressions they deal with. And they bring those to session and we talk about them. And we think about, well, we do a little problem solving, like, how did it go? How did that feel when that happened? And what would you have wanted to do or say instead? And what kept you from doing that thing? Would that thing that you wanted to do, or say, would that have been helpful? And let's think about maybe something else if not. And so you get the person thinking about different ways of responding to racism in their life. And so when you get to the third phase, that's where we call that phase empowerment, because we've moved past support, we've moved past coping, we've moved past processing these painful experiences. And now the client is learning how to approach the world differently so that when the next time racism comes their way, they're not going to be knocked over by it. They'll have some strategies for how to push back in a way that will be helpful and empowering for them. And also, oftentimes, we find that just as a natural result of the healing process, people want to make changes in their communities. They want to make the world better so other people don't suffer in the same way. And we call that activism. And I know when we talk about activism, often we're thinking about people holding signs, and that's not what it is, although it could be that. But it could be something like even like organizing a training for your workplace. Or maybe if there's a problem in your neighborhood, if there's some over policing or something, like, can you get together a citizens group to help address that problem? So there's lots of different ways that people can bring about change in their environments, and that's part of the healing process too. And so that's sort of in a nutshell the three phases of that treatment process.
Hey there, it's been a while since I've talked to you all about one of my very, very favorite sponsors. And favorite because they've been around for a long time, but also because they are literally so incredibly useful. I'm talking about ZocDoc, which is a app and a website that you can go to. This costs you nothing, $0, zero investment, and it's so easy to use. It basically, no matter what you're looking for, you can look for an immunologist, you can look for a psychiatrist, a therapist, a dentist, women's health practitioner. You can filter for example, gender affirming or trans, or let's say you have a high BMI and you're anxious about finding a medical practitioner that you're anticipating that they're going to fat shame you. You can put all of these filters in. And then what you can do, let's say you pull up some people, then you can compare them directly. There's a picture there, of course, but there's also, most importantly, patient reviews. And the reviews are real. It's a service more than a product. This is a service that I highly recommend. Bookmark it on your computer, download the app, ZocDoc.com/TU, and be sure and put the TU in so that they know that we are helping people find it. ZocDoc.com/TU. All right, thanks.
Hey, y'all, I love this sponsor, Peak Nandaka. I know I'm not alone in falling into mid-morning slumps, and then I would drink caffeine as a fix to pick me up, but it would give me the jitters or I'd have the drops. And when I switched to Peak's Nandaka, it is amazing. It's made with functional mushrooms. However, it's a 20-time extract of medicinal mushrooms. So, unlike some of the other mushroom coffees out there on the market that use grains and fillers and mycelium, this is a potent mushroom extract, and it also has ceremonial grade cacao and other things that make it taste great as well as support your metabolism. It reduces my sugar cravings and hunger pains. But what I really love is that it keeps me focused and energized all day long. I seriously love the effect. When I run out, I actually find myself tracking the delivery because I love how productive I feel when I drink it. So it's packed with prebiotic and probiotics, so it makes the digestion smooth. And like I said, the 30% cacao butter helps it absorb. So if you try it, I really think you're going to love it. So you can get 20% off plus a free starter kit. You're going to get a cup and a frother with it with your order. And when you shop exclusively at peaklife.com/TU, that's PIQUE life.com/TU, you'll get 20% off. All right, let's jump back in.
So I feel vulnerable asking this, but I'm going to do it because, it's the walk the walk. I was thinking about microaggressions. And earlier when we were speaking, I was aware at one moment I spoke over you. And I wouldn't normally think about it because I just we're just talking. But was that experienced as a microaggression? Were you even aware of it?
Yeah, I remember when that happened. I will say I didn't think of it as a microaggression because I know often doing these things, sometimes there's a little lag and people end up talking over each other inadvertently.
Okay, so you didn't experience it that way.
I didn't experience it that way, but I'm glad you asked because that is something that often happens to people of color. They often are spoken over at meetings and in classrooms. And I notice even, in my classes, I teach multicultural psychology, and I'm always like observing the dynamics of the classroom. And I notice the students of color, usually they're not saying much, they'll contribute a little, to be good contributors to the class, but it's sort of like they're in and they're out and they're done making space for the next person. Whereas the students who aren't students of color, they'll just take up as much space as they feel like taking up. And they'll just talk and talk and talk. And they'll, they don't really necessarily seem tuned in even to the fact that maybe there's other people waiting to speak. And I attribute this to our cultural conditioning. The students of color, they've learned that, their contributions aren't as seen as valuable. And I'll often meet with the students one-on-one in my class. And one of the pieces of feedback I often give them is take up more space. I say, look around, look at that white guy there. Is he worried about how much space he's taking up? Okay, so I don't want you to worry either. Okay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I imagine this imaginary George isn't aware of the space that he's taking up. And I can imagine him thinking, well, anybody can talk, because it's easy for me to talk as George and to be heard and to be listened. So, if somebody had something to say, they would speak up. So it's like projecting our own power.
Exactly. Right. Not realizing that when you're disempowered, people who have power can be scary at a lot of levels. And it's funny too, because I do work for the legal system as well, often in cases involving law enforcement. For some of the criminal cases I've worked on, we've had situations where young Black men have been pulled over by police or approached by police and have gotten frightened and run away, and then later caught and incarcerated. And now the attorney is having to try to explain why this person ran away if they weren't doing anything wrong, right? Because that's always the justification. Well, obviously he ran away because he was doing something wrong. And there isn't enough thought to the fact that the law enforcement is highly empowered to do harm to Black people and brown people. In fact, empowered to kill them usually, as long as it's not caught on film. You can kill a person of color and get away with it. So that's very frightening. That's very, very frightening, often terrifying for people of color, particularly Black men who may have been pulled over, accosted, harassed 50, 100 times, right? And it's not surprising that sometimes people have a freak out or panic reaction and run. So I've been in the place where I've had to explain that to the courts many times. And again, it's so many people are like, well, I see a police and I don't feel afraid, right? I'll go up and ask him for directions. Well, you know what? I won't, because I'm afraid. Even though they've never accosted me, I know enough people like me that they have.
I like that. And there again is that projection that we're not really thinking about it. And so we just assume, that if it was me running from the police, it would mean something different than, you know what I mean? Is that perspective taking. And can you say more about that? So clinicians who want to do a better job, they kind of think, hey, I'm a decent person. What are the common errors or mistakes that we make?
Yeah. So I think it's really important that, clinicians be able to put themselves in the other person's shoes. And of course, I know if you're a white person, obviously you're not going to know exactly what it's like to be a person of color, but that doesn't mean I don't want you to try, right? And we take time to understand people's experiences for all kinds of things. And so this is also another thing, it's important to understand the person's experience. Like, let's say you have a client who's a person of color. It's totally appropriate and valid to say, so, what is your experience, working as one of the only Hispanic lawyers in your firm, right? But I know so many therapists that would be afraid to ask that question. But that's probably the question you need to ask to understand what that person's life is like.
I love that you said that and about the fear. And again, this is just I'm just a kindergartner unlearning some things. But I learned recently that my fear of doing it wrong is part of my white fragility. So just a moment ago, even when I looped back around and I'm like, hey, was that an example? That was scary. And that's part of why I really like that term civil courage.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a good way to loop that back in.
Yes,
around.
actually, I don't even know if I got to the answering the question about what is civil courage, but yeah, it requires courage. It requires, first of all, that base level of courage to even like look inside yourself and say, what do I need to fix to be a better human being, to be able to connect and relate to the other people on this planet that don't look like me, right? But the other piece is, how do I stand up for people who are disempowered? How do I use the power and the privilege that I have that I didn't ask for as a white person, but I have it? How do I use that in the service of making a more just and fair world for everyone? And so when I see opportunities to stand up for and advocate for people of color, opportunities to center their voices instead of mine or my other, white compadres, I'm going to do that. I'm going to make space for them. That might be as simple as being at a meeting and saying, hey, I think Anne wanted to say something. Let's give her a chance to talk about what she has on her mind. If she's a person of color and, is looking like maybe she's trying to get in and say something and other people are taking up all the space. So you can use your privilege to make space for her. And that's a small example. But when we talk about civil courage, oftentimes, though, we're talking about maybe something a bit bigger, right? Because not only, are there these, microaggressions where, we might be overlooked or dismissed or treated badly in a small way. There's big things, too, that happen. Like, for example, being, accosted or harassed by police. So one example could be there's some kids in your neighborhood of color out there, just have, teens just minding their own business, playing some music. Maybe it's a little loud. A police car comes by and starts interrogating them. You could go out and say, hey, no worries, officer. They're not doing anything wrong. Everything's good, right? So as a white person, you could do that and make it a little safer for them by using your privilege. Now, some of the examples we give in our article about civil courage, they're a bit bigger than that because, really in order to stand up for what you believe in a meaningful way, that often requires sacrifice, often requires making a sacrifice. And sometimes that can mean that, you might be targeted too as a result of your standing up for the right thing. I am thinking about an example I know of a psychologist a junior psychologist who did a very favorable parental fitness evaluation for a Black father who was trying to get some visitation of his mixed race daughter up against the white mom who was very well resourced. And that mom hired a very, like, the best attorney in town to try to tear down the report that this junior psychologist had done. He had to go, the dad had to go to the junior psychologist because he couldn't afford the most expensive psychologist in town. And the junior psychologist was not really any match for the senior psychologist who was tearing apart his report. And ultimately, that mom reported the junior psychologist to the board, saying that he was working outside of his scope. He had done this bad report. He was putting her daughter in danger by saying that the dad was fit to see her. And the licensing board, they did an investigation and they interviewed that junior psychologist, and they said, basically, if you walk away, if you withdraw your report, everything could be okay. And if you implicate your supervisor, who is a person of color, that might be a more fruitful avenue for us to investigate. And at that point, he decided to have civil courage. And he said, no, I'm not rescinding my report, and I am not blaming anyone else. And I stand by what I said. And he was punished for it. He was punished for it. They made him redo his year of supervision with one of the board members, bizarrely enough. And it was traumatizing for him because he's a white person. He's not used to dealing with racism. But at the end of the day, he did the right thing because he showed civil courage. And again, sometimes that costs us. But if it doesn't cost you, how valuable is it, right?
Totally. I mean, this could not be more relevant right now with companies pulling back things, there's a choice to be made at some point. And we have felt this some even on the platform that we, the bad reviews we get are when we begin to, as we continue to share the mic and share perspective and challenge things. And what would we be doing if we can't do that? So I like this idea of there's something like a bottom line, I'm not going to goose step no matter what, like shoot me first. And there's something where that it's like, okay, I'm going to find that line. And honestly, I think of the empathy that happens when you cross over and you do something like that. The fear that we feel is just a tiny fraction, I imagine, of like, it's a way of like just a little bit of window into the empathy of like what we're not feeling as we join in.
Oh, right. Absolutely. I mean, sometimes I might hear somebody say, oh, well, because I was white, I didn't get this job, that person of color got it. And first of all, that's an assumption that you were more qualified than the person of color. Actually, you probably weren't, because research shows that you have to be way more qualified even to get an interview as a person of color. There's tons and tons of resume studies that show this globally. But if that is true, I would challenge the person and say, well, you know what? Now you understand from this one experience a little bit of what I'm going through all the time. And that maybe makes you better able to connect with the oppression that the people around you, the people of color around you, are dealing with. So maybe you can use that experience in that way to develop your empathy rather than, sitting around crying and complaining about how hard done by you are.
I love that. So I've also heard a lot about liberal white women being some of the big, causing some of the biggest problem. Can you say more about that? Do you think that?
Do you want my honest opinion?
I want your honest opinion. This is uncensored. Therapist Uncensored.
Oh my gosh, the white women are the worst to me.
White women are the worst.
White women are the worst.
Tell me, as a white woman especially, but we have a lot of listeners that are white women, so talk to us.
Yeah. And I'm going to just preface this by saying not all white women. Obviously, there's some good ones. You're here, Sue. You're a good one. But I can tell you most of the terrible things that have happened to me in regards to being singled out and discriminated against and punished have come from other white women or white men acting because white women put them up to it, weaponizing the dudes. I mean, and I think there's a lot of reasons for it, but yeah, the white women, I think they think that because they understand sexism, they think that they understand racism. And they don't. It's very different, and it's usually like a lot worse. So they don't have a lot of empathy for what people like me are going through. So I feel like sometimes when people feel like they're struggling for their own little piece of the pie, they're not really like willing to share that with anyone else. And that's been my experience.
That is, I mean, I've really, really, really been hearing that, especially liberal white women. And yeah, and in trying
No, the
to,
conservative ones are bad too.
yeah, well, I mean, the
in different
surprise,
ways, in different
right,
ways.
right.
So.
Well, I just mean that it's surprising, in liberal circles, to self-reflective, like, wait, how are we the bigger, how are we so problematic? We're good people. We have a Black Lives flyer out or whatever.
Yeah. Well, my challenge to white women everywhere, well, really to every white person, is to go to a friend who's a person of color and say, how am I doing as a white ally and how can I do better? Would you honestly tell me where I need to grow and how I can do better? And if you ask your friends of color that, they'll tell you, and that'll be humbling. And if you don't have any friends of color, you got to think about why that is. What have you done in your life that's caused you to exclude people of color from your circles?
Now, before we end, and because I do want to get back to the book, so I want to press just a little bit on the clinical part, if that's okay. So this idea of believe is so important. Is there ever, like, I do a lot of group therapy. So I'm gay and raised some kids as in a gay couple. And that question of the attribution, oh, that's because that we're gay, blah, 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 is true. And it's also, is it true? So this is just, I'm like moving back into the clinical world of the, like, say, a group or something. Is it ever, oh, and I also think about Kenneth Hardy's work on multiplicities and multiple identities, and that we're all we all harm, and we have been harmed, and we do harm. Some of us have a skew in what we've done as far as harming. I don't know if I'm being clear, but sort of that question of when to examine a statement like that, was that a microaggression, or, that piece, like, it feels like a really delicate moment.
Yeah, and I know it's hard because again, I know like you want to be careful, you don't want to do any harm, and it's easier to avoid because that's what we've been taught to do. But it's better to ask if you're not sure because oftentimes one of the things you'll find is that people very rarely actually will own or admit to a microaggression. Even when they're called out, especially when they're called out, they usually get defensive. So just by asking a person that this may be the first time anybody has ever asked them if they have, been offensive in that way. And I think it's a good model for how you want relationships to actually look. So you want to model how functional relationships should go. And one way is that people care about each other and they think, oh, maybe I said something harmful. Let me check in and ask, right?
Right. And so earlier I asked you, was that a little example? And let's say it had been. Can we just walk through as far as, because I want to model for folks, like, let's say I've really done something.
Okay.
Because I want to support people in receiving that feedback. How do we receive that feedback in the best way possible to hold on to ourselves and our integrity, but to absolutely be doing the systems work? So do you have suggestions of, like, as somebody, if you're giving someone feedback, what is it that you want to hear? What is it you want to see for the receiver of the person who's done the microaggression or macroaggression,
Yeah. So if I was to, to say to you, okay, Sue, I have to tell you, you made a remark, which I know you meant well when you said that I was like super articulate, but I have to tell you that kind of rubbed me the wrong way because I think there's an assumption in there embedded that maybe you don't expect for me to speak articulately. And that's something that can be like a backhanded compliment that a lot of Black people get. So I just want to put that out there for your consideration.
All right. So here's what I want to do. First of all, I want to tell you that as you told me, my whole stomach I know we're doing this as an example, but I could feel it. And so the person hearing it is going to feel shame, is going to feel regret. I mean, this is a good enough person that wants to do this work. Shame, regret. But one of the things I've learned is we don't talk about that. I don't need to tell you how I'm feeling by you saying this, that I keep the focus on you. And I appreciate you, but I want you to coach me, right?
Okay,
but thank you for telling me. I really value knowing that. And What else should I say?
Yeah. So, well, for one thing to understand that when the person is sharing this with you, you might be tempted to think, oh gosh, they're mad at me. They hate me. No, because they're not going to tell you this unless they already trust you, unless they have some hope that you're going to do and say the right thing. So you should actually take this as a very good sign that they trust you enough to share this with you. And also the person sharing it is anxious and scared because 9 times out of 10, when they bring up this, they get smacked down. So me on the other end sharing this with you, I'm also thinking, oh my gosh, I hope she's able to take it as intended and not get angry, defensive, or break down in tears and I have to comfort her and make her feel better.
Those white tears, those white tears. And I could see how it could happen because it's not that often to get feedback like that. And, oh, but that wasn't my intention. And let me tell you what I meant by that and blah, 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 blah. That I think that, that it's not about intention. It's about effect.
Right. And I already know you didn't mean to be hurtful, right?
Right. So I don't need to say that.
If I thought you meant to be hurtful, I would have said that very differently. Yeah, I might have had some choice words for you that did not communicate my willingness to have a conversation.
Nice. Is there an example of that?
Yeah, I might have said, let's say you were a stranger and you did some microaggression that was not in a nice way, that I felt like you kind of you had some maybe not good intent. I might have something different to say. I might tell you to keep your bigotry to yourself or something.
Keep your bigotry to yourself. I like that. That's beautiful. Okay, so this is one of the things that was very helpful to me was just this thing of everybody listening, if you're in a dominant culture, to work on practicing getting practice receiving. And it's not the time to debate what happened. It's not the time to question. You just put your catcher's mitt on.
You want to listen to the other person and you can say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. Please tell me more. Like you want to hear more about their feelings, what they have to say, because you're listening to them now. And you're not centering yourself by being like, I'm a good person. I didn't mean it. You want to center them, right?
This is really good. I mean, as much as we talk about some of these things, sometimes this part gets missed. And I appreciate you talking about the courage on both sides to listen and to take that and to be willing to make a mistake and find out about it and learn is scary. And it's really scary to be, I understand that I find this through the women's thing, but I know that it's different. But the idea of keeping a man feeling safe enough is important from a safety standpoint for me. Folks that have been minoritized, making sure that the person in power feels safe has been probably life preserving at some level.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. Because, and I have to deal with this too. Like, let's say I'm invited to give a workshop and, maybe I'm giving a workshop on, working with racism. And there's a few people there who are feeling triggered by some of the things that I'm bringing up. And they're raising their hand and they're making comments and they're microaggressing against me in the workshop, right? What do I do? So I can bring up that microaggression as an example for everyone, which is probably what I would do. But at the same time, I have to keep in mind if this person is pissed off, they're going to go complain to the person running this, who is probably a white person, who will probably take their side. And this may mean I don't get invited back again, right? So I have to be thinking about those power dynamics as well.
Yeah, it's definitely dicey. So going back to the idea of civil courage is beautiful. I love that. I want to put it in the title of the episode because it's hopeful, but it's also directive.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And we also know what can happen when we as, psychologists don't show civil courage. I mean, thinking about the situation that happened a few years ago where psychologists were involved in interrogating people. And it resulted in, the suffering of a number of people, but the death of at least one person. Those psychologists should have known, and apparently some of them did. There were some that tried to, push back a little or quietly speak up. But for the most part, they went along with it. The APA was complicit. There was lots of money to be made, and nobody exhibited the type of civil courage that was needed. at the time to stop that from happening. And then you end up where we're at after the fact, where everyone's like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? Our profession is, left looking, completely unethical and unscrupulous, even though most of us, I believe, are ethical, because nobody had the courage to speak up and say, this is wrong. This is wrong. And, we shouldn't be, torturing these people to get confessions out of them. And it's racist too.
Well, and even that like social work, which has such has this feminist background, like they embedded in their norms was racism, just in the same way as other industries. Mental health industry, I think about the private practice and the fees. You talk about mental health, the shift in that, and so accessibility is a big thing. So these are also important. Are there anything else that you want to convey to our audience, kind of in your heart? Like if they take one or two things out, what do you really want them to hold on to?
Yeah. I think the biggest one is really when people tell you, if somebody is brave enough to share with you an experience of racism or really any kind of discrimination, listen to them, right? Listen, validate, support them. And don't try to make it better. I know sometimes people think, well, if I tell them, maybe that person didn't mean it that way, maybe that will make them feel better. No, it would just make them feel invalidated. So don't say that. Really, really believe in validate and support. Now you can even say, what can I do? What can I do to support you? How can I be of help, right? If you don't know, you can always ask. And they may not know what you can do, but you know what? Just that you ask, that feels good because it shows you care and that person feels cared about. So, yeah.
Now, if people are interested in getting in contact with you or your book, your socials, can you tell people where to find you?
Yes. I have my website is monicawilliams.com, and that's Monica with 2 N's. I'm on X or Twitter, as you want to call it, at Dr. Monica with 2 N's. And also you can email me through my website. My email address is Monica with 2 N's .Williams at uottawa.ca. That's my university email address. You can reach me there. Yeah, I guess I live in Canada. If I hadn't mentioned that already, I think I said that before. But yes.
So many of us want to just slide right up there.
I'm ready to take you with open arms. We need allies in Canada too.
Well, this is, you are so well researched and so well published. We're going to link some of your papers into the thing so that people, if you're excited about this, you can go to the show notes, therapistsuncensored.com. And you can also use the search bar to find it. And anyways, therapistsuncensored.com/episodes, and it'll be right there. And so, yeah, we encourage you to read more of her work. It's incredible. And to buy her book. I really love that it's time limited. It's a short program.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, really different than, long-term psychotherapy and all those kinds of things. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for being so generous with us and kind of carrying us along. I know you've done way more than your fair share of the labor in that. So it's a real honor to hear from you.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me and bringing, attention to this really important topic, especially right now where not everybody is excited about these issues. And so, yeah, thanks for taking a stand.
If you appreciated this episode, be sure and share it with someone you think would be interested. Leave us a rating and review. That way other people can find the podcast. And yeah, we'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.